Today, bringing a different type of interview to your eyes, your ears, because there is a new series out. You've probably heard of the main series that this all was birthed from, which is the Dark Side of the Ring. Now the MMA world has the Dark Side of the Cage from Vice TV exclusively and on the YouTube Vice TV YouTube page. And today, speaking with me is Tim Healy, who was a part of this whole thing. Tim, thank you for your time. Thank you for talking to me and the opportunity to talk to you about this series. First and foremost, that name, right? Especially anyone who watched Dark Side of the Ring, your mind goes, as many would, to a dark place. MMA is just that. It is a dark sport. It is a dark place. You got to be a special type of person to get involved with that sport. What led to the birth of this, not just including the success of Dark Side of the Ring?
Yeah. First off, great to see you, Mike. Thanks so much for the time. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about the series. This was really born out of a series that we do for Vice called Dark Side of the 90s. And we decided to do a two-parter on the UFC. And really, we were interested in telling that story because, we realized that, with the success of the UFC over the last decade, lots of viewers might not understand the beginnings of the promotion and kind of what it was like back in the early days when John McCain was leading an effort to get MMA fights banned and not sanctioned in all 50 states. And, we told that story. Truth be told, it was a hard sell for us to get Vice to agree to tell that story. They didn't really think that the story was going to resonate, but they eventually allowed us to do a two-parter. It did extremely well and had really, really high ratings. And my partner and I immediately said to Vice, look, there's a series here. There's so many stories that exist in the sport, and the opportunity to do not just one season, but multiple seasons. So that was really where the genesis of the idea came from. Obviously, they've had major success with Dark Side of the Ring, which is just an unbelievably well-executed series. And once they saw what UFC 1 and 2 did on Dark Side of the 90s, they gave us the green light to move forward with this. So, and here we are.
I was saying before we started this interview that the reason I left like sports radio covering the NFL, the NBA is because I felt there was a opportunity to tell stories covering MMA. It was a sport that was still growing and it still is growing. It feels like every single few months or every few months, I should say, you've got a new narrative, a new story, and it's not just by champions. It's something happening outside of the cage, and it's so unique as a sport because you have these alpha females, alpha males who are very, very timid about their ego and their reputation. That when you look to tell these stories, one thing when this interview was presented to me, I jumped all over it. Because if there's anything Vice TV knows how to do, it's tell stories. It's what I started this podcast for. So when you enter a sport, when you look at Dark Side of the Ring with professional wrestling, that goes back generations. My grandfather could tell me about wrestling, as I'm sure yours could. But you have to approach MMA with such a unique perspective because it's still new, and in 2025, it's still growing. So, how did Vice TV yourself? How did you guys attack a sport and an audience that is still learning and growing every day?
Well, to be honest with you, Mike, it was pretty easy just with the popularity of the sport now in 2024. I think if we attempted to do this series back in 2000, I think it will be much harder, simply because, when you make a television series, you staff it with, you have a team, you have story editors, you have editors, you have producers, you have a showrunner. And I think the odds of finding people that were into the sport 10, 15 years ago would be a lot harder. I think at the level of MMA now and just combat sports in general, the popularity of jiu-jitsu, for example, I can't drive, a mile without seeing a jiu-jitsu academy. I mean, people are training now. So it really has emerged to be a mainstream sport, an internationally recognized mainstream sport. You can travel anywhere in the world, you're going to find MMA fans. So to be quite honest with you, it was all about timing. It seems like the perfect timing in 2025 to be able to enter into um, a genre like mixed martial arts. To your point, professional wrestling's been huge since the 50s, the 60s, right? Like we were all into that. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, we were all about, I remember when it was WWF, right? But I think you could make the argument now that mixed martial arts is at that same level. I think the biggest difference is storylines. Professional wrestling, you always have the opportunity to build up these characters and give them angles and baby faces and heels and storylines in the ring. I think, probably the toughest learning curve in MMA is that this is real, right? These are real athletes. They get in the cage, they lock the door, right? They lock the cage, and at the end of it, someone comes out as a winner. Now, obviously, you see guys like Colby Covington and the UFC tapping into that professional wrestling mindset and kind of building a persona. And you're starting to see, I think, a little bit of crossover in the way that MMA athletes they sell their fights, they promote their fights, and they're kind of understanding the importance of that backstory and that arc, and to build that controversy that always culminates at a weigh-in. But really, I think MMA's time is now, and that was really why we were able to make this happen.
So Tim, I did my homework. I know you are an MMA fan, and just as on TV as you would nowadays as a podcast, when you're sitting down and you want to tell the story of a certain subject, whether it be a person, an event, whatever it may be, it's got to come from within. That's how I feel. So as a lifer in MMA, how did you want to attack telling stories about the sport? Because just to name a few, we haven't even gotten into them yet, but the debut was on Kimbo Slice. You've got Diego Sanchez coming up, Evan Tanner, Nick Diaz, Ronda Rousey, Pride FC. There are so many key moments in the history of MMA and the UFC and everything around the sport. How did someone invested like yourself target exactly how you wanted to tell these stories?
You know, Mike, first and foremost, the most important thing to us and the team was to be able to tell these stories authentically. Okay. So when you have a title of a show, The Dark Side of, it immediately suggests that it's going to be all dark, right? So when we go out to book people to sit in the interview chair and speak about these subjects, they're trusting us, right? They don't want to take part in something that's going to tarnish somebody's legacy or dig up dirt. So for us, these stories are real. The Diego Sanchez episode that airs tomorrow night, for example, I love that episode because it's Diego in the interview chair being brutally honest about his career, and he's telling us his story as opposed to, we could have done the series where we didn't deal with the athletes and we just dealt with maybe MMA journalists and experts and commentators, and they're going to tell you a fighter's story. They're going to tell you an athlete's story, but is it really true? Is it really authentic? So for us, the burden that we felt was to be able to produce 10 hours of television that were true and told real stories, warts and all, about these athletes. First and foremost, I'm a huge fan of MMA. A lot of people on the team are fans of MMA. Our goal is to really take these stories that are amazing stories that not everybody knows. The hardcore MMA fan, they know about Evan Tanner. They know about the rise and fall of Pride. But if you're kind of new to the sport, a pedestrian, someone who's dipping their toe in the world of MMA, we wanted to be able to tell stories that would not only appeal to the core fan, but also someone who's a little bit more of a pedestrian, kind of a passive fan.
And to that, let's just hype it up because we're talking the night or the day before it airs. The Diego Sanchez episode will be out when this comes out. And we're talking about the story of not just Diego Sanchez and his long career, a very long career, but in particular, his relationship with Joshua Fabia. Quick backstory before I get to my question. I worked at SiriusXM in the height of all of this, and we had Diego Sanchez as a guest on one of the shows that we worked on, and he even like went to bat for Joshua Fabio, and it just you sat in the radio production room going, this can't be real. You almost wanted to stop the interview and say, Diego, this isn't going to work out for you. And we all, we will see through Vice TV that this relationship and how that story unraveled. But why are these things so important to kind of your vision for what this series is all about?
Um, Specifically what, Mike, in regards to the
In
Diego
terms of
story?
instead of looking at a Diego Sanchez and his career, and so many people said it should have been long gone beforehand, you focus on, hey, maybe he should have been gone before, but now he's intertwined with the Joshua Fabia guy, and it's worse than a fight.
Yeah, the Joshua Fabia thing, I mean, obvious, look, without the Joshua Fabia aspect to the Diego story is worth telling. It's an amazing story. Such a charismatic guy from the second he burst on the scene in The Ultimate Fighter, right? Like you couldn't take your eyes off him, his antics in the house. He's always been on like a little bit of a different wavelength. The fight with Clay Guida, it's like, he was the nightmare, called the nightmare for a reason, right? So we would have told this story anyway. But when you get into the Fabia thing, it was such a bizarre thing, especially for people that know this story, people like yourself that are in the MMA community. When he fired Jackson Wink and started to fight with one guy in his corner, everyone was looking at each other like, what's going on? And then when the footage started to leak out with the unorthodox training and hanging upside down and getting hit with sticks and chased with a knife, you know, it became even crazier. And the Fabia thing is really a huge dimension to Diego's story because I think when you watch Dark Side of the Cage, one common theme you're going to see with a lot of these fighters is choices they make at some point as to who they surround themselves with and how kind of a decision they make with their team ultimately can have an effect on their personality and their outcome in the cage, right? So, the Joshua story, I mean the Fabia story, it was, to me, it's very dark because when you see in the episode Diego on the rise, he's taking the MMA world by storm, and then he suffers this loss to BJ Penn. And it wasn't just a loss. I mean, when you watch that fight and you look at that that head kick that ultimately ends the fight, it stopped all of Diego's momentum. And really, you can make the argument from that fight on, Diego really was never the same. And we've seen this before. I mean, I remember when Gaethje fought Ferguson, and I remember watching that fight and saying to myself, I don't think Tony Ferguson's ever going to be the same again after this fight. And I think it was the same thing with Diego. He was never able to kind of get that momentum back. That loss kind of haunted him. And I think what happened was he found himself at a very vulnerable time in a very long career, never had that opportunity to fight for the title again, and saw something different in Fabia. And then not only adds Fabia to the team, but then kind of becomes almost like a disciple to Fabia. It becomes almost like a cult leader and a cult follower relationship. Full disclosure, I don't know if you've seen the episode. Diego goes really into depth about that relationship. I'm still confused. I still can't really put into words kind of how and why that happened. I don't think Diego can really express exactly how it happened, but it was a disaster for him. I mean, ultimately, Diego lost the opportunity to have a retirement fight against Cowboy. They were going to do it in Albuquerque. It was going to be a nice payday. The UFC was really going to do the right thing for Diego and kind of send him off the way that he should have been sent off. And then Fabio blows it up and requests medical records. So it's an insane story, and it's one we really felt was worth telling.
Tim, just a couple more, and I appreciate you giving me your time today. Thank you so much. I'm so excited for the Diego Sanchez and all these episodes. We talked earlier about kind of the crossover that we may be starting to see from a storytelling aspect of professional wrestling and MMA. I think, as I said, coming from a sports radio covering other popular sports, the four core sports here in America, you don't necessarily get stories until somebody makes themselves a story, either by becoming a multiple time world champion or they do something to get in trouble with the law. That's how you get these storylines from the NFL and the NBA and all these other sports. But with MMA, because it's so new, because you're right there. You're not attached to a team that your family grew up loving. You're caught on by one person. The way to tell stories is through Vice TV, through Dark Side of the Cage. So as a lifer in MMA and then having the talent that you have in show business, how do you intersect the right way of I love this sport, but the world needs to know that there is so much more than just a win-loss record to these fighters?
Yeah, it's a really great point. I mean, we could have very easily done book reports on each subject, right? So this was the first professional fight, and then he fought this person, and then he lost here, and kind of tell a linear story that just tells the story inside the cage. We didn't want to do that. These are human stories. These are complicated stories. These are multidimensional stories. Sometimes they're tragic stories. Um, I mean, look, if you're a fan of the sport, or if you train yourself and or you're around people that fight, you know that it's a very specific mindset that gets someone to take part in combat sports. To your point, it's not a team sport. You know, you're not playing baseball. You're not one of nine. Um, it is the most solitary sport. I mean, even wrestling and collegiate wrestling, it's a team sport at its core, even though it's an individual sport. I think the mindset is just so unique of what inspires someone to pursue combat sports. Even hobbyists. I mean, even people that train MMA or train grappling or jiu-jitsu or sambo for fun. If you're around people like that, they're not like everybody else. There's something about them um, that makes them unique, which is why I think if you do train, you're so tight with your teammates, because you're kind of spend so much time together, but you're on this different wavelength. You're pursuing something that most people don't do. So for us, it was these are unique people with very specific motivations and very interesting lives that they lead, not only in the gym and in the cage, but outside. What was it that inspired Nick Diaz to become a fighter? Um, what was it about Evan Tanner that inspired him to jump on his motorcycle and ride cross country to a state he'd never visited to, and to walk into Team Quest with a bag full of books and basically say, I wanna be part of this. Like, MMA fighters are cut from a different cloth. Um, they're wired differently. And I think if you're part of that, you understand it. But I think if you're an outsider, it begs that question. Why does this person do this? What is it in this person's experience that has led them to this pursuit? And as a storyteller, that lends itself to just a really unique opportunity to tell some really incredible stories.
People may be watching this and going, "Well, I can't wait for the Conor McGregor episode."
I can't tell you, Mike, how many emails I've gotten about that, and how many times people have said, if Conor keeps going on the track he's going, he'd be perfect for season two.
Well, I mean, not to make a full thing out of this, but if you just look at some of the most polarizing figures, not only are they covered here in season one, Kimbo Slice in the debut episode, the series debut, and now we have Diego Sanchez. Ronda Rousey's covered in season one. If you look at Ronda, if you look at John Jones, if you look at Conor McGregor, those are three of the most notorious, no pun intended, kind of egos to ever be in this sport. The stories are there. You could do a whole season on John and Conor by themselves. But I commend you for the direction and the stories that you are going to tell in season one. The list is phenomenal. As a lifer in MMA, and as a great storyteller, what has been your favorite thing about Dark Side of the Cage?
I think the fact that we got Nick Diaz to sit, um, Mike, when we decided to do the Nick Diaz episode, we fully expected to tell the story without Nick's participation. It was an amazing story. Who doesn't love the Diaz brothers? We knew it had all the elements of a great episode. The team was like, we're going to get him. We're going to book him. I said, it's never happening. It's not going to happen. Robin Black works on the show. He's a creative consultant. Robin Black is the man that made it happen. I mean, he and Dave over at Vice Studios took 6 months for them to secure an interview with Nick. I think Nick stood him up on 3 different occasions with a crew waiting for him to show up. And the fact that my phone rang one day and they said, "You're never going to believe it. Nick Diaz is being interviewed right now in Houston, Texas." And when I found out that he sat for almost 3 hours, for me, that was like a personal victory. In my opinion, I think we have the definitive Nick Diaz interview and Nick Diaz episode. And for me, like that was a real win. Just because you know how elusive and challenging Nick can be when it comes to not only doing any kind of press, but also getting to talk about himself. So that one was it was the highlight for me.
I'll ask you this then. A lot of people will talk about Nate Diaz in 2025. Nick is obviously the origin of Nate Diaz, right? The older brother. I feel this way. So someone who's been directly involved, I'll ask you. You believe I'll particularly to Nick. Do you think the Diaz brothers are misunderstood?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that's one of the core questions that we investigate with the Nick episode. It's Nick Diaz versus the world, right? It's like, is he misunderstood or is he his worst enemy? You can make the argument both ways. I personally, I think they're misunderstood, but that's coming from me. And look, I'm a Diaz brothers a fan. I'm a fan of their fighting style. I'm a fan of the way they carry themselves. You know, there's something really inspiring about two guys where they're all about them. They're about their team. They're about their family, and it's like everyone else is an outsider, and you have to respect that. And they don't play well with others, but I think they wear that on their sleeve. They'll be the first ones to tell you how they feel. There's nothing fake with them. There's no BS. They don't put it on for the media. Like, I think really what you see is what you get with them. And I think that translates to the sport. There's no bullshit in mixed martial arts. It's like you're going to walk in the cage, they're going to lock it, and then one athlete's going to impose their will on the other one. And that's how it's going to play. There's nobody to blame. There's no excuses that can be made. And I just think that, the Diaz brothers have this kind of a punk rock attitude. They are who they are. They're true to themselves and to each other, and everyone else can go screw. And I think they're pretty clear about that. So in my opinion, I think they're misunderstood.
Well, the best thing about that question is we'll find out the answer to it on Vice TV, on Dark Side of the Cage, throughout the season. So many episodes. Like I said, this will release the day of the Diego Sanchez episode, Vice TV, YouTube, and then subscribe. Obviously, like every episode, and leave your thoughts because that is necessary to let everyone know, like Tim, how these episodes are going, how they're perceived. And we're going to find out so many stories in the world of MMA. And Tim, thank you for giving me your time, but also, like I said, as someone who wanted to get into MMA to tell stories, and I haven't done it at a worldwide level, but I do think I've done an okay job with allowing fighters to tell their story. I'm not here to tell it. The UFC has told us the story of the Diaz brothers since they began. So I can't wait to see Dark Side of the Cage, not only Nick Diaz episode, but all the episodes, because I want to hear it from their mouth. So I commend you. I tip my hat to you. I'm a fan of you after our first conversation and all that you guys do. I think what Vice TV does from an investigative standpoint is phenomenal. And you've got a fan not only just in what you do, but in who you are. So thank you.
I appreciate the time, Mike, and big fan and appreciate everything you do as well. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.